All right. Now we're going to jump into a little bit of the GraphQL AppSync dynamodb API. Let's get a little bit into that. So first, right, GraphQL. Yeah, that sounds good. Our primary authorization type is going to be Cognito. Okay, yes, I do. I'm going to make some additional changes. Usually end up using I am, but we don't need it yet, but I know I'm going to end up needing it at some point, right? No, because we're not going to do the data store, which I believe that is for. Yes, I do. And we're going to walk through it. Oh, crap. Okay, see, I don't actually have it yet. So what we really want to get to is the point where, right, they say, no, no, I don't. And we're just going to use theirs because it's going to generate the file for us. It's going to be like, hey, do you want to edit? And we're going to be like, yep. I'm going to drop the schema in here. Okay. So if I go in here, now we're going to discuss a little bit about the types I discussed here. Okay. Right. So we don't need this. We will need GPS because that will get used, but it will not be a type. It'll actually be used as part of our location and our establishment when we use Elasticsearch. So for now, let's start with establishment, right? That's what we're going to call it because I think it's a general enough term. So let's say at model, right? Okay, just to get started. And okay, so now we have to consider like who's going to be able to access this establishment. Now, let's assume that this is going to be accessed by both the public, private, and public, and then also certain details of the establishment will be available only to, say, admin, right? So first, let's start with at auth rules allow, really, does allow, that's right, the email, the phone. No, okay, these are all public details. You know what? We can just make this public because we want them all to be available. Allow public provider. I don't think that's going to work because if I recall correctly, that's really only for API keys. So if we do Amplify API GQL compile, it will tell us if we're right or wrong, right? It'll pretty much compile this into the build folder for us over here. Amplify backend API, your API name, which is where the rest of your functions sit. There's our auth, there's our API, there's our API name. This works correctly, okay, which it did not. This is complaining about an S3 object that does not exist. And this is actually going to be a string. Now they talk about S3 objects, but I like to, really they all follow the same pattern. It's always like the same endpoint and then some kind of pattern that it follows. So we're not going to be using S3 object. So that's what it's complaining about, right? And then unknown type, S3 object. So let's go find this other one, establishment vibe. Doesn't exist, so we're going to get rid of that. Let's see what we got here. It says it worked, so we can check this to see what it spit out for us. If we go, again, backend API build CloudFormation template, this is where it spits out. Okay, so if we go to like our resolvers, we'll see everything for establishment because we added the model directive, so it's going to create a dynamodb table for us. and then we didn't specify which method, so it created all of them for us. Okay, so here's a list of all of these. Now, to be honest, we're going to end up using Elasticsearch for the queries, but for now we'll use it, but in the future we'll end up removing those queries, okay? And it'd be something like, I believe it's like this, right? And then null or something, I can't remember. Anyhow, we'll get to the docs and get there. But what we really want to look for is make sure that this set up the right permissions for establishment. So I type establishment here, right? It's not popping up, which means that it's, oh, there it is. Okay, cool. So what this is saying is that what this is doing is authorizing us through CloudFormation. Okay, here's our auth policy. And it's saying, okay, allow establishment, there's our review. So this is just doing this out the gate. It's not specifying. There's our on-auth policy. Boom, this is what we're really looking at, because this says public, right? So public means it's for unauthorized users. So we want to be able to go in here and see which it's doing for all of these. So if we do type name, so it'll be like a type name, which would be establishment. So if we do type name establishment, we got two of those, right? That's cool. But what we're not seeing, okay, which we need to see, is authorization of the methods. So there should be something like list establishments, right? Okay, cool, that exists. Now let's go see which auth policy that's under. Okay, perfect, that's on our unauth role policy. So unauthenticated users can in fact call query list establishments. Now, this type query doesn't exist, right? Because Amplify is auto-generating it for us. If you want to see what it ends up generating, which will get pushed up to AppSync in the long run, again, every time Amplify compiles before a push, or you run that command, Amplify API GQL compile, right? It's going to create everything in this build folder. Okay, so here's our stuff. Anything in the stacks and resolvers folder will essentially overwrite anything in the build folder for the API. But if we go in here and check this out, right, this is our schema that actually ends up getting built. Okay, they auto-generate a lot of the stuff, so this is pretty cool. So there's our establishment, right? Now if I do type query here, it doesn't exist. However, if we go to type query here, boom, because it's going to auto-generate all of our mutations, our queries, our subscriptions. In addition to that, it's also going to create all of our inputs, okay, that are listed here, right? This is amazing. This is exactly what we want. Okay, this is all just off of these two directives. Okay, and if we go to CloudFormation, I'll go back here. So there's our, right? So we have our query list establishments, which AppSync is authorizing for unauthorized users to hit this endpoint. Otherwise, it would fail and say we are not authorized to hit query list establishments, but we are, because we've allowed the public with IAM. Okay, cool. So the next thing is when you see this, if we go into our stacks, okay, there's our custom resources, which comes from here, which we got nothing in there, right? Just empty resource, okay. But really, this is what this is doing for us with this at model. Is going to create us a dynamodb table. Okay. Now it's setting up our key schema, which we haven't identified. So if you don't specify your key, we'll automatically create one. The attribute name ID will be a string, apparently, right? Because ID actually translates to string. Even though you have ID here, there's no concept of ID in DynamoDB. It's all just a string, right? So here's a bunch of other stuff, and there's our rules that allow users, okay, to hit the GraphQL API / all of our operations for DynamoDB, which include put item, get item, which end up being auto-generated and connected to a bunch of resolvers, right? So we go to our resolvers folder. Here's our get establishment. Okay, this is cool. So for get item, oh, lost it. Let's go back. Okay. And this is connected to DynamoDB, but how do we know that? Where would it say that that is connected to DynamoDB? So we're looking for a resolver, right? But it doesn't create the resolvers here. This is just the setup for DynamoDB. Oh, no, I'm dead wrong. This is exactly what we're looking for. Here's our establishment data source. Okay, so what happens for AppSync, what it does, we throw this at model directive, it generates a table, which I showed you above, in permissions, but then it also generates a data source, okay, for connecting your resolvers to your data source, which is our DynamoDB table called establishment table. Okay, very cool. So, and then there's our resolvers that's creating. So get establishment resolver, use the establishment data source, which is going to be, again, a DynamoDB table. And then on our query, get establishment, right? There's query type name, because that's what it is. And then there's our field name, which is get establishment. Very cool. Bada boom. And it is connecting it to our data source for us so that this resolver here is connected to DynamoDB, right? And then it's automatically generating our request for us to where we're just passing an ID because we haven't specified anything else, okay? And then this is saying, hey, this lives in the deployment bucket, which is a bunch of auto-generated stuff, okay? But in the resolvers, ultimately this folder, resolvers, right? Query, get establishment, request.vtl goes to this one, and then here's the response template. Right, boom, 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 boom. Okay, cool. And that's going to do that for all of the other methods. So for the query, the queries, the type mutations, this is going to be those, and then the type subscription. Awesome. All right, so now we have our establishment, okay, which users will be able to access. Let's think about who's going to be able to access the establishment, okay? Let's talk about this. So we're going to have users who would access the establishment. Really, let's say I'm an owner, I have multiple establishments that might come into play, but it's not going to come into play out the gate. But we might eventually need to add a different key to the table. So if we do, when you add keys, right, essentially create primary keys and sort keys based off of the primary index or whatever you want to call it, and then GSIs, which are your global secondary indexes. So if we go like this, if we forget the name field, it says, hey, this is the primary key for this. So if we go back over here with that hash key, here's our key schema. And this is for the primary key for the table, right? It's defaulting this because we haven't specified. But if we come in here and we remove and we don't use the name field, this will create our primary hash key and sort key. So first of all, it's going to be ID. And I know we're going to need something else later. It's almost always valuable. Sometimes you can just have one, but I like to have a primary sort key on the index because I feel like I'm getting something out of it. So let's say we had an owner ID, which maybe boiled up to say like a restaurant group, okay? So let's add a field called owner ID, call that ID, right? And then let's say we're a restaurant and I want to go look up all of my establishments that I own, right? So here we throw an owner ID in the ID. So what happens is this is going to change this key schema, okay? And you'll see this update here after I run Amplify API GQL compile. See what we got. Oh, it says it's non-existent. It's because I spelled it wrong. Thank you for the heads up. Bada boom. Hit that real quick. All right, and this is going to generate everything in the build folder once again. Let's see what we got. All right, come on, baby. All right, type. So we see what just happened. It just updated this. Okay, very cool. Now, let's say that's all we need for now for an establishment. Okay. We decide we want to, this is a better scenario, all right? Ultimately, every location, if we depend on, let's say, Google or Foursquare, okay, there's always going to be an ID that is attached to it. So let's say we're using Google to find our locations. Okay, but we're not because they'll mix in with the results. And they can go get the details. Okay, we'll come back to that. All right, cool. So there's that. For now, this is all we're going to put. This way, if I'm an owner, I could say, hey, go grab all my establishments. Let's talk about a check-in. Okay, a check-in. Create a model for it. Okay, a check-in really belongs to two people, right? It belongs to a restaurant and to the user or the diner. Okay, let's call them. So let's talk about the keys that we would need. Well, I guess we should do auth first. Well, let's do the keys and then we'll talk about auth. All right, first of all, check-in is always going to be owned by two people or two sets of users, whatever we want to call it. So the first one, let's say fields. Okay, we have, we'll call it an establishment ID. We'll call it an ID again, but really it's going to be the establishment ID. Okay, and then we're going to have a second one. Let's call it the, there's the restaurant ID, and then we're going to have a unique ID, so I guess we can't do that. So we'll have ID, establishment ID, right? And then we're going to have, get rid of that. Don't think we need that. This will auto-generate for us. This is based off of Google, so we'll get rid of that for now. Okay, this just makes it easier so you can look at them and not have to go grab details later, but this could always change, but it's unlikely. Okay, so then we should say user ID, right? Because we know a user is going to be the one who's doing the checking in. So let's say a restaurant wants to see all of their total check-ins, okay? So if they come here, right, they're going to have to be able to search by their ID. So if we say fields, establishment ID, and ID, okay, this is going to allow us, based off the primary key and sort key, is we are going to be able to check into this location, right? We're going to be able to check into this location by using those keys. So the next one we want to add, right, is for users to be able to check their check-ins. So we need to add a GSI on here. So what that would look like, we'll call it name. Let's say user check-ins, okay, fields, we'll say user ID, ID, right? One thing we're forgetting, right, is going to be check-ins by date. So we're always going to want to be able to go look at these check-ins by date. So you do one of two things. You could create unique IDs, or we could do another thing, okay, which I'm actually a big fan of, we get a little bang for your buck, is really this, even though this is a unique ID that will be generated at some point for us, really the primary key and sort key that this generates is its own unique ID. It's just it's called a hash, right? It's a combination of the two. So I'm an establishment. There's a good chance I want to go look at my check-ins by date, right? So let's go down here. let's say created at, it's an AWS timestamp, I believe. AWS timestamp, right? Let's do that. It's going to have to be required. So let's do that like this. We'll say created at, so that an establishment can go get all of their check-ins, okay, by created at date. And then I'm a user, I probably also want my check-ins sorted by a certain way. So let's say I go, say user ID, we're going to do created at 2, right? Now I eventually might want to go see all of my check-ins by establishment ID for a tally of some sort, but we're going to have to add a second GSI or create a universal GSI that could be shared here, right, where we're creating two different types of records on check-in, but really it's all the same difference because a GSI is a replication of data at the end of the day, and we can either replicate it with another GSI or share a GSI on that table. But anyhow, I'm getting a little too deep. So there's our created at, there's our establishment ID. Okay, cool. So now establishments can grab their check-in records by created at date, and then users can check in theirs by user ID. Okay, and then we will say, I like to name my query fields get user check-ins. Do the same thing here. Query field get establishment check-ins. Cool. So we're good to go here. Bada boom. Get a lot of bang for our buck there. Okay, now we still need to do auth, right? So who's going to be able to look at check-ins? We could make this a private or public thing. We definitely know, okay, that rules allow private owner field equals establishment ID, but really I think we want to make check-ins public, right? And we might want to be able to hide check-ins from specific users, which is a good thing. So what we'll do first is we'll say allow public provider IAM, because we're going to, users are going to want to see total check-ins from a place. It's going to say, how good they might be. So that will generate that. But really, maybe we don't want to make the user ID totally available, right? Because that's kind of I'm just going to get rid of ID because we don't need it. Because it's kind of like maybe I don't want people to know where I've checked in at, right? So the only people who will be able to see the user ID, let's say for now, just the user. So we'll add a rule just on this field, right? Rules allow private provider user pools and then we want to say identity claim, right, is sub, which will essentially map this field to this and say, hey, if this doesn't match, don't return the field. So let's check this out real quick. Let's do a little Amplify GQL and see what happens. It's not query fields, it's query field. And timestamp is spelled wrong. Well, not wrong, but so we're not allowed to define the query field on check-in. Okay, that's what it's saying. Can't define this here on their primary key, which is this, our primary key, because it doesn't have the name field. So we got to get rid of that. Right. Now what I'm expecting this to do is create a resolver for user ID. Okay, that would exist under check-in user ID in our resolvers. And I would expect it to have some kind of cognito authorization saying, hey, does this belong to you? Okay. Oh, I see. Set auth on the object, not the field. Okay. So off. Okay. So I believe. Let's go to our Amplify docs real quick. GraphQL CLI. Let's talk about subscription. When we'd be here. All right, there's a subscription automat. And then here we go. Set auth on others, not the field, is stable on the object. For now, we don't need to have that field, but we have to have it, right? We have to have user ID because it's required by our keys, otherwise it will fail. We're kind of stuck in a pickle here, so let's change our model, right? Subscriptions, it's an object, and we'll say level public. See if that worked. Okay, I'm going to double check on the auth. So they changed the rules for identity. Is identity claim, sub. That's right. And then so you need to add owner field here too. I believe. Okay, hold on. Let's find out actually. Okay, so let's see what we got. So if we do a check-in on any of the responses, there it is, boom. There's our check-in user ID. Okay, so what's happening here? Check-in user ID. Okay, we're saying auth rules allowed, identity claim sub, but does not seem okay to be checking anything here. No authorization is happening at all. Okay, so per field. There we go, field level authorization. Okay. So let's say allow owner, that's what we want. Allow owner field equals user ID. Provider is user pools, which I think is assumed, so get rid of that. And then identity claim sub, because ultimately we want to map our cognito user IDs, which we'll get into later, to our user ID, which will give us authorization on things. So let's give her a go. Very cool. Oh, see, beautiful. Just what we wanted. Okay, so if auth mode is empty, which it is, and if there's no blah, 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 so what we're really looking for here, right, is it's going to take our allowed owners, which is based off of the user ID that's on the check-in, okay, and it's going to say our identity value, which is going to be our identity claim sub. It's going to get our user sub, and it's going to check if our allowed owner equals identity value, and if it does, okay, it will return user ID. If it does not, okay, we're out of luck. So go here, there's the response, okay. If it exists, it'll do it. If not, it'll say unauthorized, and that's fine. It'll just error out. You won't be able to get it. We won't make it available either on our GraphQL side, but that's a different conversation. Okay, I'm a user, right? Excuse me. Okay. Right, rules. Let's say allow owner field equals ID, identity claim sub. We'll do the same thing for pretty much all of our rules here. Some don't look right there. Oh, no, okay, that's right. So for that, okay, they're going to be able to do anything they want. So for now, only a user can see their profile. We're going to map all these things later. Don't have that. No such thing as that long. Not sure why that exists. Photo will be a string. Description, maybe gender, birth date, first name, last name, maybe a username. String, right? Okay, cool. And then, although, to be honest, y'all, I'm not sure why we have a user profile. Maybe this would be their public-facing profile, and then the other details would be on the user, but honestly, the less tables, the better in my mind. So there's two types of users with these details, right? There's like a user and then a user's profile. But we can add these and just specify what details are available. So you know what? I'm just going to get rid of that altogether. Okay, let's go back and check our types, check-ins, menus. Okay, we haven't got the feedback yet, or review as we'll call it. And follow it like other users, we'll get to it. Check-in, okay, cool. Got rid of that for now. I'm going to add those things here. Okay. Right, add these details. They have probably have different types of users. Right. And again, I always like to get a second hash key out of my @ keys, even if I don't use them. All right, so let's say fields. This up here. Fields ID, and then who do we want to search user by? Out the gate. Not sure if there is another scenario where that would be useful. Okay, we're just going to let it be. No, I can't do it. Just can't do it, my boy. So I'm going to do ID, which seems redundant, but if you study any single table design, Alex Debris, the man, the myth, the legend, talk to your boy. He knows what's up. Go find his website, but he talks about this and pretty much it's just there's almost always a use case. Maybe we could have different types of users. Maybe we could say, you know, the first key would be something that would be like an enum, and we'd say user type, right? And we'd say, something like enum user type, and we'd say, consumer, and we'd say, owner or something. We'd come in here, we'd say user type. Okay. So that we can get, say, users with their public-facing profiles and then other users without public-facing profiles. So I could just be talking out of my arse there, but we're going to go with it for now. I'm going to run Amplify API GQL compile, see if it works. And what's also cool is when you put this in here like this identity claim, and define the field, it's should be passing in those variables for us. So if we go to like query, say create user, which it will spit out for us here in a second. Okay, we're going to get rid of that because we don't need it. Don't think we need that either. Owner of, it seems like this could be, okay. Do that for now. Cool, that worked. Okay, so if we go to say mutation create user, okay, comes in here, I'm expecting I get to create an ID. That's interesting. Allow owner field, right? Da 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 da. Owner field ID. So, because really what we want to happen here, okay, is we want, we go to create a user, which, you know, honestly, that's never going to happen. It's always going to be on the other side. And I don't like to use the AppSync GraphQL API in my Lambdas. So, and this is going to end up being a post-confirmation Lambda where we create users. So honestly, I'm going to go to mutations. Go back here for a second. Right. There's our field level, but we need model. We want to get rid of mutations, so we should just be able to, here's mutation types. Model mutation map, there we go. So create, no, update for sure. So mutations, go like this. And we'll say, equals update equals update, and delete equals delete. And that ought to work. And that way we'll get rid of mutation create user because we don't need it. The only people who should be creating users will be a Lambda for us post confirmation. So we should see that disappear. Boom, gone. Now I am curious, what I would expect this to do is when we run other operations like say update user. That's what's wrong. Okay, because you see this created this generic mutation update and then mutation delete, which is not what we want. I'm curious still. I want to see sub, right? It should be passing it in for us. Sub. Could have swore. Yeah, because it's a whole bunch of stuff, but really input ID. Yeah. Yeah. See, really, I don't want users to be able to pass IDs. The reality is I want them to be able to do that on their own. Oh, there's some other directives in there that I know will essentially do that and pass it in for us. So let's go to the auth again. I could swear. And then Okay, let's just do operations. Update. Operations, right, which we're looking at here. Update, delete, read. Again, I still want this. Get user still there. Yeah, I want this to pass in. We don't want to pass in an ID. It should pass our identity claim in for us. That's the whole point. I thought owner, ID, right? Yeah. Could have swore it used to auto-generate for us. It would be so amazing. Let's give her one more go. I'm curious. Yeah, it's one thing I don't want to do is go update this to pass in this because, well, I guess that's not true. I guess if I'm a user and I want to go get another user, we'd want to do that. So for now, but update users should be limited to, maybe that changed that, but again, I still want to pass in my, what I'd expect to see is, okay, it's going to do those checks. This, I expect us to inject the input ID if it doesn't exist. Something like this. There's owner, identity. Authorization checks, expression, right? What are we really looking for? And it's going to check. There's ID. Claims get sub. It's going to check our identity. Auth expressions. New. Okay, well, again, yeah, I'd expect this to, oh, maybe it does. It goes to the auth condition, doesn't equal nothing, which, group auth expressions, no. Total auth expressions, what's this defining up here? Owner auth expressions, right? Which there are. It's going to put all the expressions in there, which it will. Total auth expression. Right, so we don't need that. That one exists. That one exists. Which in fact does equal that at this point, right? We do have owner auth expressions, right? Boom. Okay. Cool. And so it's going to go through them. We really only have the one. It's going to say equals the total auth expression plus the auth expression, which would be owner auth expressions, owner ID equals, so say that equals that, or that, right? Where is it actually going to collect? So that's going to get our identity ID. Our owner ID is going to come from where? Identity 0. So the owner equals identity 0. Owner equals ID identity 0 is going to be this, which is going to pass. Owner ID equals identity 0. Again, I still expect this to put this in here. Okay, we'll come back to that. All right. So now we have the idea of a review, right? Which is going to be the same here. Which we got as a check-in, really. Same idea, same logic for the most part. So we're just going to come over here and do all this. And add this to the rest of the stuff that's on here. All right, we got our establishment ID, our user ID created at establishment itself, which we'll do connections in a second. Okay, so we got reviews. Okay, how we need to do, we got reviews, we got check-ins. All right, let's do follow like restaurants. Okay, get rid of some of this, it's over the top. Okay, and again, honestly, a lot of these end up being the same. Right, so then we have a let's call it an establishment like for now. Sure, allow it. We'll allow likes. Right, check-ins. Da 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 da. Okay, we'll do that and the created at when it was then, and then we'll call this user establishment likes by user. All right, get establishment likes by user. Cool. And you can only like an establishment once, right? Versus a check-in we could have multiple times. This is really where this differs. So there's our check-ins, but imagine if I wanted to get all of my check-ins from one restaurant. How would I go about that? Well, there's a couple ways when we think about it. One is going to be the created at. No, I'm sorry. Okay, hold on. Let's step back. We essentially need a way to get out of our sort key here, a way to look up restaurant check-ins by user, by date, and by restaurant. I don't think we're going to be able to get that out of this unless we create a second table or second GSI where I want to go get all my check-ins from a certain location. Now we could do one if we added this here and said establishment ID, right, to the end, and then we could do, hey, go get all user check-ins Okay, and then we could filter down to the establishment ID. The only problem with the filter is the filter is applied after a query. So let's say eventually I have more than 1,000 check-ins, which who knows, 365 days a year, let's say 5 years, you hit that, that's a much, much later problem, but it could happen. So we're gonna leave it for now. We'll think about how to do it the other way. Okay, cool. So now we have establishment like, here's the user ID created at the establishment name. There can only be one of these that exists. So user ID, we still want the created at, but we're not going to be able to look unless we would want to go search by likes. User should only be able to like an establishment once, right? So really, but if I'm an establishment and I want to go grab my likes by date or most recent, they won't be organized. So really, technically, a user here will be able to create more than one like. But I think we'll be able to go add logic down the road. So we're still going to add it here for now. Really, I guess we could do time, but really we just want date. Say I'm a user, I want to go get my establishments. I'm a user, and I want to go get my most recent likes. I'm a user, I want to go get all of my likes. Okay, that'll do the same thing. Okay, let's just leave that be. I'm not sure this will ever need, but maybe in the check-ins that would be needed. Cool, so we have a like, we have a check-in, establishment check-in. I guess we won't because it's not an establishment. It's not a like. That is a direct like. This is a check-in, and a like technically exists, right? And eventually we will have, okay, we'll come back to that too. Cool. Now let's say we have users and we want to follow other users. Type user follow, or follow user, right? We'll follow user, right? And add model. Okay, I can bring that up here. Okay, add key fields. We're gonna have an ID, which will be a string, or an ID rather, and that will be the user. Let's call this the user who followed another user. I always get confused when I do this. Okay. User ID, so follow. Oh, user followed. Let's call it that, right? Follow user, user followed. Okay, and this will be user. All right, user. I'm following. Say user ID. ID. I'm following. That will be an ID. Okay, so let's go in here and say, hey, I want to go get all my followers. So I'm going to do that. And we'll have another one called users who follow me. say query get users who follow me. I guess it wouldn't be me because you could always put, let's call it users who, it's users who follow. Yeah, let's call it. Let's call it users. Let's call it just followers. User, let's call it followers. Okay, I'm getting too confused. Let's say get followers. Okay, now we're going to start getting into, let's just make sure that runs. Do nothing wrong. Cool, that worked. Okay. So for a second, let's talk about connection here. Right, okay. So we have a user, right, and we have a follow user. Okay. So let's say I want to get my followers. It's going to be user at connection fields ID, right? However, we need to specify our key name, okay, which is followers, right? What this is going to do is create a resolver for us on type followers that will go grab all of my followers. Okay, so this is saying, hey, make a connection to this table, which would be follow user. I screwed that up. Okay. Let's call this a user follow. So I'm getting confused. User follow. Okay. So I have a user follow saying create a resolver, okay, that attaches dynamodb to this field and says, hey, make a query on this GSI, okay, right, and pass in this ID, so we'll only pass in the first ID, okay, and this will get me all of my followers by my ID. Right, now let's say I'm a user and I also have a followed, okay, it's going to be a user follow again, except this time our at connection, if you don't specify a key name, it just goes off the primary key. So we don't need to specify that. We do fields ID again, because this time it's going to make a request against this primary key. It's going to pass in ID again, except this time, right? And we'll call this user followed ID. And this should be switched up because we're going to get confused. So I messed up when I said that earlier because they were reversed. So now when I do this, right, still here to this key name, it's going to pass in ID for this field. So it's going to run a query that says get my users, okay, by followed ID. Okay, cool. So that should be our base. Let's see what else we got for some connections here. So we also got what? Let's go back up the line here. We have, let's call it establishment likes. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing. Establishment, right? At connection. Okay, we're going to use this key name. It's by user, so key name. We're just going to pass in our field ID. user ID, cool. Run that real quick, should go. Establishment likes. Okay, what else we got? Well, establishment wants to see their likes too, right? So let's go user likes, we'll call them. And we'll call it establishment like. Say add connection, fields, ID. Cool, so that's going to connect to this one. It's going to pass in the ID, so that I will get these user likes, and this will get my establishment likes. So what else we got? We got followers, followed, establishment likes. Ooh. Build. Dang. Cool. Ooh, key field. Oh, what is that? Oh my, I always love seeing something new on there. Let's go to connection and check that out. Sort field, key field, that was awesome. Give me that. It's on the connection. I see, okay. That's kind of cool. Alright, we don't need that. Does not exist. Let's get that. Right, so I'm a user. Yes, it does. Don't lie to me. Just kidding. I spelled it wrong, probably. See what I did there. That does not exist on establishment. It exists on establishment like. That is the problem. Okay, cool. Saving us from ourselves. So there, just specified establishment like. The thing we're going to end up putting on here is like the establishments themselves, right? And then the users themselves. So we'd come in here and be like, okay, establishment equals add connection fields establishment. Right, okay, and then the same thing for user. User ID, right? And this is going to end up being used a lot of places. So like, let's say check-in, same thing. We want to see the user or the establishment or get the details. We need to add that. Let's do that here. What else? A review, same thing, right? So on the likes, on the check-in, okay, on the review, and then on a user follow, the same thing with the user, right? And we want two, right? We want user, we'll say user followed will be add connection fields user follower ID and user followed. What do we call it? User followed, user follower. I'm the follower, and they're the followed. I'm the one who's following, and they're the one who's followed. I said the word follow too many times. It don't make sense no more, y'all. Okay, sorry. That little outburst. My goodness. All right, let's give her a go here. Okay, cool. User is followed, right? Get a user there. Oh, indeed, indeed. There's not a type. User type. Ooh, I love this. Okay, so this is an interesting one. This is passing in on a key on a user, right? And it's not. This is where we need. It's so disappointing. Okay, this gets fun because we've segregated our user types, okay, into essentially public and private by saying user type, consumer, owner. This is causing problems because, right, but I don't really care for this because now this is complaining that I can't use user field to pass in on a follow. I can't pass in any user for that matter on this, so it has to be by ID. So really we're tricking this, and user type's not going to be required, but we're going to end up doing is saying first ID will be of type will be type user type, aka consumer or owner, or maybe staff, right? Which would eventually maybe break down to like in this ID we can like stuff some stuff in there for like, you know, how would I put it? Essentially we could tell this ID and create this ID for a user, and like a user would have like say like a restaurant ID attached to it at the beginning, and it would be something like, you know, the first ID would equal, you know, restaurant, be a combo that would look something like, you know, some random restaurant ID, right? Okay, and then we'd have a hash, and then we'd say, you know, staff. Okay, and then the second ID listed there would be equals user.id. And so then what we get out of this is really cool, is like eventually if they do have staff, right, or something of the sort, I could say, hey, go do it like this. With parameters would make more sense. Restaurant, establishment, .id is staff, right? And then this would be user.id. So and this would be the primary key, and this would be the sort key, right? But we'll get back to that later. So Okay, user ID, right? Makes sense. Just ID. One more time. Close but no cigar, right? So if I go get all my user follows, here's the user I followed, right? If it's confusing. Call this following user. I always get them confused. Whatever. It's such a hard one to name. I don't know why it's so hard. It really shouldn't be. Open to suggestions if y'all come up with something. Okay, we're going to come back to this. We've got this. Do we have an establishment follow? No. Let's go create another one. And we could share the user follows between types, right? So we could have like restaurants and users. Because I really don't want to have separate tables. Because not necessarily always more tables the better. So if we change this to user follow ID, we'll just call it followed ID. But we can't. Okay, well, we're just going to add another table. We'll call it an establishment follow, but we're going to follow the same convention we did for like all the other restaurant owned ones, like check-ins. So we're always going to do establishment ID first. We're going to have to do the auth on the follows later. For now, establish. So you have user ID, we have establishment ID. Same spiel, and then boom. So this is going to be user ID. This is going to be establishment ID. Cool. Hot dog. Oh, come on, baby. Work for me. Let's see what you got. Right? So now type establishment, establishment like, establishment check-in. We have a review, we have a user, we have a user follow, we have an establishment follow. Cool. I'm gonna put this up here. We're gonna call this too. No, we're not. Yeah, we're gonna leave like that for now. Cool. Here's the big moment. So now we're going to do an amplify push for the big reveal. Oh, we're going to go over here. See what we got going down. It's a fun one. That's another good one. Honestly, the next big one is going to have to be the Elasticsearch because it's the one that takes the most time. And I'll probably mess up the most because it's been a minute. They make it easy, but we have to add the location stuff. So essentially with like Elasticsearch, we have to index certain fields and tell Elasticsearch how we want to search them and how they can be searched for so that we can do location aware. Here we're just going through some more. We do want to generate all our queries and subscriptions. We really only have a max depth. Let's just leave it at, let's do 4 for now. We can always come back and change it. Bada boom. Bada big boom. It's going to end up over here at some point. And we get the double whammy for the AppSync. Oh, it hates us. That's fun. You some bitch. Okay, so this is saying something about query with the field list users. What's the problem? Can't pass the same parameters. Why you gotta do be dirty like that? Alright, we're getting into some of the GSI PK stuff. So, I'm gonna say that I'll call this. Oh, yeah, you're gonna get a little taste today, boys. Let's say primary key, ID, let's say PK. say ID right now. Say ID, so we can differentiate the two. Bamba. Bamba, 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 bamba. Boom. That ought to fix our problem. Woo, yeah, 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 yeah. Yes, we do. Yep, we sure do want to generate them. Let's go 4. All right, looks like we're getting there. I'm gonna take a minute.
So you'll say Stack Overflow on top of that?
Yes. You guys mind if I chime in? This is my first time on Clubhouse, so thank you all for letting me be in here.
Here as different perspectives from all the different developers as we can.
Yay. Well, just kind of speaking to the introverted side of things too, I think Stack Overflow, GitHub. Those are all excellent opportunities. And to kind of continue on that thread, I think a lot of people focus too on the skills needed to code, but very often do we forget the soft skills as well. So taking the opportunity to, I find myself
Did it though. Did it though. Well, we got a fix for this right here. But everything else went through. So that's good. There is no SRC. We will create one. Amplify code gen. Da, 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 da. Interesting. Is that no one? Huh. Makes sense. All right, cool. Looks like we got a little magic here. That's working. Oh, okay. No moss. Make sure everything deployed. I like to come in here and separate our tables into groups because I got like a million tables in here. Create a group, and we're gonna call it. Oh yeah. Okay, so we don't know. So we know that this, right? Because we just created that, I didn't have that anywhere else. So that is going to be something we can grep by. So we go to WX, right? WX7. Come in here and grab all of these. These are all our tables. Bada boom. Create. Review app. Boom, boom, boom. There's all our sort keys. Some of them have indexes. Some of them do not. Very, very, very cool. All right. That is our second step, I suppose. Get branch. We're going to say get checkout. GraphQL API. Get add-on. Get commit message. Add initial pass. GraphQL API. Get push. GraphQL API. Okay. And get branch. So we're going to go get checkout day one. Get merge GraphQL API. Very cool. I'm going to do get push on that. All right, gonna take a breather. Sounded like I said I'm going to take a breather. No, I'm going to take a breather.